Well, greetings, everybody. It's a pretty darn good crowd out tonight. I assume there's lots of fans of Dr. Bush out there. This is our first Hawk Talk of the spring 2024 season. That is correct, right? Yeah, it's winter, but we know what I mean by that. We still have 3 more ahead of us. But today, this is the first one. This is the second one where things were being given away. And I know that Lisa Gunther once did one, and I still have my little duckies from that one. But now we get to have things that you can go home and grow. And I don't know about you all, but I could use something that gives me a little peace of mind, a little meditation, a little just working with slow plants. And Dr. Bush is the person that knows how to do that best. She holds a bachelor's in science, a master's in science, and a PhD, all from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, all involved with either horticulture or education or administration or some combination of all of those things. This is her 5th year here at Northeast Community College, and she has taken on lots of different hats. She serves the public, she serves her students, she serves her division, and I'm pretty sure I'm missing other things that I know, like there's the LEAD, I think, program it was called. If you want anything to do with horticulture in this part of Nebraska, Dr. T. Bush is the person that you want to know. And so I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to give the floor to our honored speaker tonight, Dr. T. Bush. Well, give it a second.
Oh, green light.
Turn green.
Yeah, it's green. Can you hear me? We had it working.
We did, but we'll go ahead and
She can use her teacher voice.
No, I think I would get exhausted after a while. Okay, so I am Dr. T. Bush. I am technically an agriculture instructor, but I hold this secondary title of the horticulture instructor with 1 adjunct in my division. And so we are working on 2 mini grants at the same time. The first is called Hawk Talk mini grant. The second is a seed library mini grant, and there's many moving parts to that. Tonight is our outreach for that about gardening. We will have the seed library up and going within probably 2 weeks, and that'll be upstairs, I think, right, Jen? And that will be kind of a donate seeds and take seeds at will with some rules. But there is one at the public library as well. We want to get one started here. It will be open to the public, so students and members of the public can participate in that. And then tonight we also have plans to give away because we're just trying to get the world to be a greener place. So the read aloud that Lisa has going on is also happening, and that's the extra part of this grant. We have lots and lots of moving parts. So tonight I want to start talking about how to start a garden so that that seed library can be used in conjunction with tonight's talk. So how many of you have gardened before? Oh my heavens. Okay, so how many of you then would consider yourself a novice gardener? Okay, so that makes me feel better. We have a few intermediate and expert gardeners in here, it looks like. So at any point tonight, you may interrupt me and you can ask advanced questions because I wrote a very gardening 101 talk for tonight for truly how to start a garden, right? So let's get going. So this is pretty much going to be our agenda tonight. We're going to answer these questions, and if I don't go into enough detail for you, ask. That's the whole point. I don't have enough slides to fill an hour and a half, so the questions are important. All right, so seed catalogs are really like the harbinger of the gardening season. And they start showing up in November, and us plant people squeal like little girls when we see them in our mail. Okay? So has everyone seen a seed catalog before? All right, Jen has a few up in the library now. We're subscribing to those for the public. But seed catalogs can come from both reputable and non-reputable sources. So if you aren't sure what you have, ask someone who knows, because a non-reputable seed catalog is going to make you one of the most frustrated people on earth. And you're going to get seeds that are either low quality or not what you asked for at all. That's not good. But we're going to, like I said, we're going to answer these questions, and I just want you to remember, gardening is cyclical. This past year, we saw a lot of disease and insect pressure that we have not seen in a long time, related to drought, which is also cyclical, right? So we have to remember it's annual, but it's also sometimes on a 5-year or a 7-year chance of success. All right, so first, when you're starting with your seed catalog in the fall, you're asking questions like, what do I want to plant? How many people know what kohlrabi is? Courtney does. All right, so not very many people, right? But you might hear that word, or you see it in the catalog, and you're like, I don't know what to do with this. So you have to kind of know what you're doing, and you don't when you're beginning, right? If you are an intermediate or an expert gardener, you have records from previous years. Even if they're stored in your head, you know what grew well and what didn't, or what tasted good and what didn't, or which things were a pain to take care of, because tomatoes can be the devil, okay? Dave, I thought you had a question there. Okay, so answering these questions. I just said this last year we had a lot of weird disease and insect pressure that we had not seen for years and years and years. Is anybody familiar with some of those pressures? What were things that gardeners were challenged with last summer? Go ahead.
Extended drought?
So the drought, yeah, that's problematic, and that's tied to the El Nino and La Nina cycles, right? The rain and the dry. And those are predictable to some degree, but we did go into a 3rd year of La Nina, which was unique. What else? What?
Grasshopper.
Grasshoppers. Yeah, some people saw an influx of grasshoppers. Pollination. We will talk about, is that what you said?
Yeah, pollinating.
Yeah, we'll talk about some of the challenges with that here in a minute. We also saw something called aster yellows last year. Did anybody hear about that on social media? Okay, so aster yellows affects members of the aster family, the daisy family. And so if you had marigolds in your garden, you could have had trouble with aster yellows. But this is a mycoplasm that doesn't show up very often, so we don't talk about it every year. Okay, so we did talk already about those seed catalogs, but this is where you decide what you're going to plant. Now, seed catalogs know how to market. They include bright, colorful, pretty pictures and little tiny paragraphs about what this thing is and how it should taste. Now, when a seed catalog says something's going to taste sweet, it's not necessarily like sugar, okay? So you have to learn how these are written. Now, there are some key words that you're going to see in seed catalogs, and if you've never read one before, these words seem alarming. But there are basically 2 types of products that you can buy from a seed catalog. There's an heirloom and a hybrid. So an heirloom plant is typically 50 to 100 years old or even longer. We have some heirlooms that we can trace back hundreds of years, but they are supposed to be unaltered seeds that give us plants with great color, great flowers maybe, great size, but they don't always have great taste. Okay, so if you've grown an heirloom, you might be disappointed that it doesn't have a really sweet taste or a really rich taste, but they are old ancestral plants, and there's some value to them. The hybrids are bred by seed companies to have desirable characteristics. So a lot of hybrids on the market right now are things like bush-type cucumbers or bush-type beans, trying to keep them more compact, more user-friendly, maybe a better flavor, better color, but they give up some of that ancient genetics that we might desire. So they come with their pros and cons, right? The challenge with the hybrid is it hasn't been on the market very long, and maybe it's not as great long-term as we think. So it might be disease resistant, but it might cross-pollinate very easily. We don't know. Questions? Paul?
Yeah, so why would I get an heirloom?
What's the point? Because it sounds like other things would taste better.
Yep, and that a lot of people feel that way. Heirlooms, again, are more about the ethics of preserving seed for generations, but also some of them are really kind of cool. Like you can get purple beans, for instance, that are heirloom varieties. So they're ancient, but they're also cool. Was recently watching a documentary that says in the last 100 years we've lost 94% of our heirloom varieties. So that means bad things for our genetic seed bank.
And so participating in that, in growing heirlooms, helps to keep this going.
Correct.
And it can just be fun to see what people used to eat.
Yeah, it's the whole controversy of hybrid seed being owned by seed companies where heirlooms are truly owned by the public, and so it keeps genetic diversity in the population. Jerry?
So why do they pick 1951 for the years to start the lineages? Is there something special about 51? Or, why did they say 1960 or 1940? I mean, 51 is such a
That is kind of a weird number. I don't know that I have a great answer for you, except that a lot of genetic engineering and very selective breeding has probably happened since that year. And so that's just what they've determined, according to definition. Okay, so continuing to ask, what do you want to plant, right? Your space is going to determine your ability to grow certain things. If you only have a container on your patio, you only have about 3 square feet of space to grow something in. So I have a few horticulture students in the room. What could you grow in 3 square feet of space? Peppers, yeah, you could do that. Could you grow a pumpkin plant? That'd be pretty tough, right? So space determines what you can grow. And if you're a novice, there are easier things to grow than others. So I have some of those listed up here. Now, I would argue that tomatoes are not a novice crop, but a lot of people start with those because they like them. I know that Dave grows peppers for all of eternity in his house, year-round. Potatoes, carrots are pretty easy. You still need to do a little research, and trial and error goes a long way. All right, if you're an expert, you could try something that is new to you in the catalog, like the kohlrabi, the fennel, the okra. Try the things that you don't know what they are, and you have to do a little more research. The cucurbits, anything that binds, is going to take up a lot of space, so you need to be aware of that before you plant it. And even the bush types that they're marketing right now still will want to lay on the ground and take up space. So they have to be trellised or they have to be contained. All right, so this is something that every gardener needs to be familiar with, and this also determines what you can plant where. This is our plant zone hardiness map. This is the new one, as of 2 months ago. This plant zone hardiness map lies to us a little bit because they're based off the average coldest temperature. In the last 4 years or so, we've had extremely cold temperatures, but they're not reflected in this data because this is 30 years of data. So that's not moving the needle enough to control the hardiness zones. So we're currently in a solid zone 5. When I went to college, we were in zone 4. So we need to be aware that you truthfully probably need to think about that change and be aware that zone 4 is a safer zone for us to grow in. The zones go up in numbers as it gets warmer, for the record. Okay? You notice the sand hills, they're pretty cool. They are still in a 4B, they're still in the zone 4 because of that cold winter. Okay, so continuing with what do you want to plant, you read the catalog and it will give you some details. And it'll say things like 77 days. And you're like, what does 77 days mean? What that means is from the day you plant it in the soil until the day you harvest a tomato, it's supposed to take 77 days. Average. Okay? Because even germination, they might tell you is a 10-day germination, that's an average. You'll have some that come up in 6 and some that take a full 2 weeks. So always average. But this is based on, some plants are based on growing degree days or growing degree hours. That's related to the minimum number of heat hours that something requires to produce fruit. So corn is grown that way. Most of our other vegetable crops, we are counting just true days, because most of them are annuals and they don't care. They just want to make babies and die. So in some cases, what you want to do is you want to say, all right, I want to have tomatoes by June 1st. And if it's a 77-day tomato, I simply count backwards 77 days from June 1st. And that means I need to start my tomatoes on March 16th. Is that doable?
No.
Not if I want to grow them outdoors, right? Okay, we're going to talk about that for a minute because temperature is a limiting factor both in terms of heat and cold. So we do have plants that are considered cool season crops, basically meaning that they will live and sometimes thrive as long as they are above 29 degrees. And you might think that's weird because 32 is frost or freeze, right? But 29 degrees is considered a killing frost. So most plants can survive to 29 degrees if they're cold tolerant, okay? So if we have a cold crop, they cannot tolerate heat and they will try to flower and complete their life cycle, and that process is called bolting. That means to send up a flower shoot. When that happens, most of those cool season crops become bitter. Their sugars are converted to starch, and that starch is used by the plant to reproduce. So if you've ever eaten spinach or kale or lettuce that tasted a little sharp and a little bitter and not pleasant anymore, it was trying to flower. So some of the cool season crops that you might be familiar with, maybe you don't love everything up here, but these are plants that are cool season tolerant. They actually prefer early spring and late fall soil temperature. Any surprises?
When onions bolt, is that going to make the onion taste different?
Onions are kind of unique on this list. They're a biennial, so the first year they won't. The second year they do their best to flower. The storage organ on the onion that you eat is the stored sugars for the second season.
I'm just kind of surprised that so many of these are root crops, when I would think the soil is going to be pretty cold, like colder than, maybe I'm just thinking of frozen soil and so I'm overthinking it. But is that kind of common? Cool season crops, a lot of them are going to be roots?
So Jake, does the air temperature or the soil temperature matter more to a plant?
Soil.
The soil temperature matters more. They can tolerate pretty cold air temperatures, but remember, soil has its own buffering effect, so it will take it more energy to freeze below that 29 degrees. All right, then we have warm season plants, right? Now they actually are affected by a minimum temperature that's a little higher. Sometimes that's 55 degrees. That's kind of a magic number in the plant world. And so they're definitely going to freeze at 32. In fact, they might show stress below 55 degrees. These are going to be plants that we love, the cucumbers and the tomatoes. I have a list of them here in a minute. But they actually can also be impacted by high temperatures. And this is where my little old lady gardeners want to argue with me because they have experience, right? But science still counts. So something we need to be aware of is that above 85 degrees, plants have some weird features. One of them is that their pollen denatures, which means the enzymes kind of unwind in the pollen and it becomes sterile above 85 degrees. Additionally, the female ovule, which is what the egg is basically represented by, can abort above 85 degrees. So not only does the male portion of the reproduction not want to work, but the female portion will abort to try to keep the plant alive. So if you are having temperatures above 85 degrees, and this means your day temp and your night temp are not dropping below 85, you're not getting new fruits. You might be ripening the ones that are already on the plant, but new fruits will usually fall off or not be fertilized. So hot summers that we're experiencing as climate change occurs are also negatively impacting as much as the cold winters. So here are some of your warm season crops, right? These are like the farmers market things that we go and we buy because they're good and we don't want to grow them ourselves. So what time should you begin planting? And this is really a good balancing act in Nebraska. Nebraska is an interesting state. From one side of the state to the other, we have almost 2 feet change in precipitation from Nebraska City to Harrison. We also have vast changes in freezing and thawing, and we'll look at that here in a second. So we have to look at weather, we have to look at what plant do we want to grow. Many things that go into account on when do I actually start the garden, okay? Most of us get a little excited, me included, and we're like, oh, we're gonna start things inside, so we start them in January. What happens when you start a tomato inside in January? It's about 2.5 feet tall when you're trying to transplant it. Okay. So we need to slow down. What did we say we should start our 77-day tomatoes when? What did we say?
March.
In March. So be patient. Give it another 6 weeks. Okay? Getting them started now, unless you're a vendor at a farmer's market, is not going to help. I tell the students, and they've heard me tell this terrible joke before, that excited gardeners keep our industry in action because we sell them 2 sets of tomato plants every year. Right? We sell them the first set, they plant it, and it freezes, then we sell them the second set. So this is the UNL Crop Watch data. Look at these dates. This is what they call a low risk of freeze, meaning you're basically at your end of last frost time period. But look at the change across the state, right? We go from the last frost being about the first week of May, where it's light blue, over to that Crawford and Harrison area, where it can still freeze until the end of June. And these are average figures, right? This is happening. Sometime in June, they're still freezing.
Does that mean you just cannot do horticulture in the western portion of the state? Because when do you grow then?
Most people in the western part of the state will not plant until after June 1st.
And then just try to harvest by September? Or?
Yep. Now, they're a different breed of people, right? I'm a sandhiller, so I can speak to this, but they're going to preserve a lot of their food. So their gardening isn't necessarily intended for, immediate consumption, but for preservation. This is another great guide. You can find things like this online, right? But this just shows you, it's got a calendar across the top, and it shows you kind of green would be the best time to plant, red would be the best time to harvest. Some of these crops you get 2 crops out of because you do cool in the spring, cool in the fall. So peas, it's a great example, right? You're going to try to harvest them. Apparently Wendy doesn't like peas. We're going to harvest those twice, but our plants will usually decline and we'll need to go ahead and kill them in between those 2 harvests. Tom?
So I see lettuce on this, and all of them have green start seeds indoors to harvest. But a lot of times, like lettuce, so you just kind of sow that right into the dirt outdoors, and then can you even start lettuce indoors?
You can. So that's another set of terms you might see in a seed catalog. So thanks for bringing that up. We have the term called direct sow. If you see the term direct sow in a catalog, that means this plant will not handle being transplanted. So direct sow means you're going to go ahead and plant that directly into the garden, and that's going to be things like carrots, beets, turnips, your root crops, and lettuce. Okay. Many other things are going to be transplantable. So if it does not say direct sow, they're inferring that it can be transplanted. Now, I was always taught that onions are direct sow, but I spent a month in Colombia, South America this summer, and we transplanted, we sowed onions into little trays, and then we transplanted them into the garden about 2 weeks later. So, test it. You never know what you might figure out. So where will you plant? Now this is, you guys probably all have a thought in your mind about where you want to garden. So you're landlocked, you know what you have available to you. And so you might have not very much space, or maybe you have some health considerations where you can't bend over completely to the ground. So we have options, right? We can do raised beds. We can do what they call a ground bed growing in the soil. Containers, and that's just a fancy word for a pot of some kind. And up here it's a mineral tub. It's still a container. And then you can also do indoor gardening. So if you're not very adventurous or you live in an apartment, you can still make this work. But where you grow is going to determine what you can grow. We started with that. Whatever you do decide to grow, the biggest factor is the soil. Plants are very tolerant about what's going on above the soil, but very intolerant of where their roots are. So in many cases, field soil, pure soil that's in place, intact in your backyard, is not good. Nebraska does not, I mean, it has good soil or we wouldn't farm here, right? But it doesn't have great gardening soil. So potting soil, as this is compost probably in this picture, but potting soil or compost are often going to need to be added to your existing space. How healthy is your soil? Does anybody, many of you raise your hand, does anybody test their soil?
How do you do that?
It was sad. So how do you do that? There are 2 labs in Nebraska that you can send your soil samples in. I think it's about $30 a sample. It's not that big of a deal. You take just a little bit from an area, from your garden. You're going to take kind of a random sampling, so just a little bit. You mix it in the bucket, and then you take basically a Ziploc bag full of that soil, and you mail it into one of those soil testing labs. So if you want more information on that, anybody in the agriculture department can help you get that going and even walk you through it in more detail. But they're going to send you about 6 pages of information about that soil sample, and it's going to tell you what your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are, which are the 3 big nutrients for plants. And you can also have a micronutrient test run. You can have a magnesium and sulfur test, which is going to tell you a lot about color and flavor. It just kind of depends on what you want to invest in. But for a farmer, we recommend once every 5 years. For a gardener, I might even say every 3 to 5 years, because you're more intensively cultivating that space than a corn farmer, for instance. What's the temp of the soil? We've been talking about how important that is. So if our temp is above 55 degrees, we know everything will be alive in that soil. There's kind of a gray area between 32 and 55. Not all of our microorganisms are alive. Not all of our seeds are alive between 32 and 55. How deep is your soil? This is an interesting question because I don't know if any of you guys watch Backyard Farmer, but sometimes people will send in questions to Backyard Farmer, and the answer is really simple, that, oops, there's a piece of plywood 6 inches buried under where you think you're gardening, and nothing can get down, right? Maybe you're over a cistern, and there's still a limited depth. So how deep is your soil? And then we talked about the soil testing, the fertility, right? Also think about some things that you might take. Oops, I hit the button. There we go. Think about the other things in your yard that you take for granted. Paul?
Is there do I need to have 6 feet of soil depth? Like what are we really looking for there? And I have a follow-up.
Okay, he has a follow-up. So most plants are going to maintain their roots in about the top 18 inches of soil. Even, side note, most trees have their roots in the top 18 inches of soil.
And the follow-up is you're talking about the soil types, getting potting soil and whatnot. And a couple years in a row now, I have a compost pile, and I just thought, I'll plant pumpkins in it, and I'm sure it's going to go wonderfully, and it never does. Is there such thing as soil that has too many nutrients in it, or can that be overdone? Are your horticulture students going to tell me, well, I'm really dumb doing this? Is that what's coming?
There's only 4 of them in here, so I'm seeing if anybody knows. Colby, do you want to answer?
When stuff decomposes, microbes heat up the soil, so they can't grow in hot soil.
Oh, all right.
So it has to do with your carbon to nitrogen ratio. If you have too much nitrogen, which is green, grass clippings and whatnot, it gets too hot.
Okay, all right. So it's not the nutrients, it's temperature. Temperature.
It could be both, but lot, but you might have a small acreage. How close are you to light and water? Because if you've ever had to drag 300 feet of hose multiple times a day, that gets old. So are you close to water where you're going to put this garden? Accessibility. You have to walk from your storage location, your cellar, your house, whatever, to the garden multiple times a day. Because if you are only doing it once a day, you're going to get behind. Okay, so how accessible is it to the spaces you need it to be accessible to? Do you have a path, or are you tripping over things? Please, please, please always call Digger's Hotline before you dig. Does everybody know that Digger's Hotline exists? Okay, 511, I believe. 511. They're going to 811. Okay, in my head I was like, which one is it? Okay, 811. They're going to ask you really basic questions. What's the address that you're going to be doing this at? And they usually respond within 24 to 48 hours. So it's not like you have to plan 2 months in advance. It's free also, by the way.
Why would you do that?
So that you don't hit your own gas line and blow up your house. They'll locate any utilities in your yard, and even if they can help you, sometimes even find your own irrigation lines if you don't know where those are. One of the things we want to mention in gardening is crop rotation, because if you're going to use the same plot of land over and over and over, I talked about insect and disease pressure when we started, but soil can become very contaminated with the same weed seeds or the same diseases or the same insects, and so crop rotation is very, very important. One of the plants we struggle with the most is tomatoes. Tomatoes suffer from something called nematodes, or nematodes, however you want to pronounce it. But they form root knots on the tomatoes that don't allow them to take up water anymore. The thing is, a nematode is a microscopic groundworm, and nematodes can move up to about 20 inches a year. Now, first of all, think about that. That is a long way if you're a microscopic worm. 20 inches is a long way, but they can't move any further than that. So if you move your tomatoes 3 feet from where they were last year, you will reduce nematode pressure. It's that easy. The other reason we want to do crop rotation is that some of these are what we call heavy feeders, and some of them provide nitrogen back into the soil. So anything in the legume family, any beans, peas, etc., they put nitrogen back into the soil. Our tomatoes are heavy feeders, and they use it all up. So you can see why farmers do corn and soybean rotations. Put the nitrogen in, use it up. We also can practice something called intercropping, and this is becoming more and more popular as people are leaning into having more biodiversity. So intercropping is planting plants in amongst other plants. So instead of having 10 square feet of onions, you plant the onions in with another crop. Now, onions are one, I shouldn't have used that example, because onions can actually share their flavor with other plants, so we have to be a little careful about where we put those. But you can plant tomatoes and cucumbers in amongst each other, as long as they're not damaging their companion crop, because cucumbers will climb and try to take over the world. But intercropping does increase biodiversity, and it brings in good insects that will combat the problems. And then this is true companion planting. So this is an indigenous practice both in South America and North America, and that's using plants that can either depend on one another for some benefit or provide some sort of insect or disease pressure release. So the Three Sisters cropping that the Native Americans did was a true companion planting. Corn, squash, and beans. Other things you need to consider when gardening. Mulch, right? Are you going to use mulch to suppress weeds? Because if you are going to just, I hear so many people say, this year I'm just going to pull the weeds every day and I'm going to stay on top of it. And that lasts for about 6 days. You don't even get a full week out of it. So mulch is probably going to be a very big requirement here to just slow that down. It's never going to stop it. It's going to slow it down. There are both organic and inorganic mulches available. And organic means it was once alive. So something like a grass clipping would be organic. Inorganic means it was never alive. That's going to be like lava rock. Please don't. That's just a nightmare. Okay. Pest control, do your research. There's a whole strategy called integrated pest management. And in that strategy, chemical use is the last option. Chemical use should always be the last option. Sometimes it's the only one that works. I'm there. I use chemicals too. But be aware that there can be some what they call residues, which means chemical that stays left over. So you need to read the label, make sure it's approved for use on fruits and vegetables, and check something called the post-harvest interval. That means how long from the time you apply until you consume that product. Okay? Very important. We also have already talked briefly about water, but please remember not all plants use the same amount of water. Many of our garden vegetables are water hogs. They need to be watered every day. But tomatoes, for instance, let's say you're gone at work all day and you come home and they're wilting. So you hurry up and you turn water on. And the next day you go out and you harvest your tomatoes and they're all cracked. That's because of a fluctuation in water. Too dry to too wet. So this can happen with a lot of our thin-skinned vegetables. Composting space, Paul brought up the composting. If you're going to do it, please do your research. No meat or dairy products. You need plenty of space, you need water, and you need patience because it's going to take time for that compost pile to get hot enough for those bacteria to do their job. And you can use manure on your garden, but chicken manure especially needs to be composted for about 18 months before you apply it. Cow and horse manure has a lot of weed seeds, so I would do that with caution. Manure in general can carry E. coli and salmonella, so there are some recommendations about food safety that I can give you more information on. And then just remember, if you're going to commit to a garden, you need to commit to it. Gardening takes a lot of time. Quite frankly, I don't garden right now in my life because I travel during the summers and it just takes too much time. Last step is, and we talked about those sandhillers, right? What are you going to do with what you grow? Some of us use the method of leave it on our neighbor's porch and run away. Okay, that works well. Some of us bake it into things and pretend that it's healthy, like black bean brownies or zucchini brownies, right? But in many cases, we grow so much that we're going to have to figure out how to preserve it or keep it during the winter season. So you want to ask, what goals do you have? Am I going to try to eat all this myself? Am I going to try to sell it or give it away? Or am I going to preserve it? And there are a lot of resources out there for safe canning and freezing. Not all vegetables can be frozen, and not all of them tolerate canning. So again, the University of Nebraska Extension does a great job on food preservation and food safety, and they are the state trainers in those areas. So kind of, we're wrapping up here, right? What are your limitations? Your biggest limitations are nature, because that is out of your control. Everything that you have control of, you can fix, but nature is always going to get you. So gardening is all about trial and error. You're going to mess up, and that's okay, because the last bullet point here, if you don't tell anyone, they don't know, right? You can buy 50 tomato plants and only manage to keep one alive. And if you don't tell anybody that, you'd be like, I got the best tomato plant I've ever had. Okay? No, I do know there's a grammatical error up here, but this came up on Facebook yesterday, and I felt like we needed to celebrate. So now, I gave you guys plenty of time for questions because I covered this, like I said, at a very 101 level. So the floor is open for anything you may want to ask.
And if you could repeat their question so we have it on here.
Sure. Dave.
In your opinion, what would be your best advice for mulching for idiots?
in my opinion, was my best advice for mulching. So the trick with mulching is, especially if you're going to change your garden next year, you want to mulch in a way that can biodegrade in 365 days. The method I have found that works best is overlapping newspaper covered with something like grass or wood chip mulch. Newspaper is probably the most effective weed barrier that is natural, because you can buy a weed barrier, but it's plastic and then it goes to the landfill. So newspapers work really, really well. They do have to have something on or they'll blow away. Paul.
So you had said earlier that a lot of people feel like tomatoes are a good novice plant, but they may not actually be. I feel like every time I've grown tomatoes, it's super easy. They go crazy. Until last year, they got covered with black mold, and it was no-go. Why would you say tomatoes are not necessarily as easy as sometimes we think they are?
So tomatoes are not as easy as we think they are, because to actually grow a tomato plant well, you have to give it one-on-one attention.
Yeah, they weren't delicious. I'm not saying I grew delicious tomato plants. They were just a lot.
Well, what many people don't know, okay, of course tomatoes, you probably know they need to be trellised. There's two basic types of tomatoes, indeterminate and determinate. The determinate tomato is going to reach a certain height, it's going to stop growing, and it's going to produce the bulk of its crop all at once. An indeterminate tomato literally will grow forever and continue to produce fruit forever. So while I was in Colombia, they had tomatoes that were 2 years old, continuing to grow, produce fruit. Both types need to be trellised. They need to be caged so that they will hold up their fruit, because they're not very sturdy plants. But many people don't know that you can prune a tomato plant, and that will give you more energy that goes into the production of the fruit and less into the production of leaves and foliage. There we go. Into the production of leaves and foliage. And that will also help reduce some of your insect pressures, so tomato hornworm, for instance, or mold, because the more canopy airflow you have, the better you're going to reduce fungal infections. Tomatoes also should not be watered from overhead. They need to be watered on the ground with drip irrigation, because fungal spores and bacterial spores splash in water, so we don't ever want to have a water droplet splashing on a leaf. I think also because they crack, we have to have consistent water. Tomatoes also tend to go through calcium really quickly. That can also cause blossom end rot and cracking. So finding a high calcium fertilizer with low nitrogen, because nitrogen promotes foliage, not fruit. So a lot of people tell me I'm fertilizing the heck out of my tomatoes, but I'm not getting any fruit. Well, you're sending the signal to your tomato that it should just be green and fluffy. So, there's your 3-minute speech on why tomatoes are very hard to grow.
So you talked about heirlooms at the beginning, and mentioned that a lot of the heirlooms have less taste. But my favorite to grow is heirloom tomatoes. And I heard some farmer was telling me that those are actually, they have more taste because those desirable qualities are for grocery stores. They want them to be consistent. They go for color and shape and not for flavor so much.
Yeah, I think that's true. A lot of our hybrids are intended to be short season, so they get into market faster. They're intended to be bright red, round, thicker skinned, so they can handle shipping and handling better. A lot of the heirloom tomatoes have a very high acidity, which is where you're getting so much flavor. But there are a lot of people that don't like that acidity because of indigestion problems and other issues like that. So we see a lot of tomatoes on the market that are considered low acidity. The challenge with that can be canning them, because food preservation requires good chemistry, right? So, like I said, there's pros and cons, and if you prefer the heirlooms, that's great. Pam?
So, if I were a fantastic gardener, which I'm not, and I suddenly grew this bumper crop, and I took it to the farmer's market, could I just walk in and find a space and put my produce down and sell, or are there laws or guidelines that I need to follow?
That is a very detailed question. So Pam wants to know if she can grow a bumper crop and then take it to the farmer's market and sell it. So I'm going to give you the Cliff's Notes version of that. No. The farmers markets are overseen by the Nebraska Department of Agriculture. You have to register your business with them, and you have to have a certified weights and measures. And so for most of these, if you're going to be selling them by the individual, so if you sold every tomato for $1, that's different than selling a tomato by weight. And if you sell a tomato by weight, you have to have a certified scale. Also, most farmers markets are overseen by a local entity similar to a board, and you have to buy into that farmers market, and you have to commit to that booth for the entire season. So there's a lot of laws and regulations around it. I think, did I mention it? Yes, at the very bottom there, it might be hard to see. Nebraska passed, in the last 10 years, I can't tell you what year, they passed a cottage food law, which means as long as you post at a farmer's market or a vendor stand that this food was cooked and prepared in a home kitchen, you could sell it. It used to be that it had to be in a commercial kitchen that was approved by the Nebraska Department of Ag, and now the cottage law allows you to make it at home as long as you post that. Basically, you're assuming liability if something goes wrong. But that is another way that people can take that preservation to another step, and they can sell zucchini bread or choke cherry jelly or whatever. Yes, Paul?
I've been using some planter boxes for the past few years, and every year I'll take off the top 2-3 inches, get some potting soil, and then like some dolomite, I think it's called, and fertilizer, put it in there. Should I be worried about the other soil? Should I be changing out the whole soil every year or every few years, or is it okay that that stuff just stays on the bottom half of it?
Yes. You should be probably excavating that starting over no more than every 3 years. First of all, potting soil does in fact break down until it's no longer doing the job that it's meant to do, which is hold water and air. And that can cause some compaction issues. Additionally, all the disease and insect issues we were just talking about, 3 years is about the most you should really be testing those waters before you resolve the problem. If you're using a planter box like that too, when you do a soil exchange, you really should wash the inside of your container with a 1 part bleach to 10 parts water and let that dry. Like wash it and let that dry. That will sanitize and keep bacterial and fungal issues from building up, and is really cheap.
Thank you.
In the back.
That's sort of, I guess, the license, or the expiration date for potting soil or garden soil.
It is sell the bag. Like you have a bag and you haven't used it yet.
Yeah. Kind of just like have it in the garage, store it, and decide I'm going to just use it this season.
So what's the expiration date for potting soil? So I'll answer that question both ways. If it's still in the bag, we're usually after 2 years going to start to see some pretty good decline if it hasn't had air, because it'll have moisture trapped in there and you'll get a big fungus buildup inside that bag. And if you've ever opened an old bag of potting soil, especially if it got wet, you might just give up on it. Outside of the bag, meaning we've used it and it's been in the container, again, I would say no more than 3 years. You can tell the texture of it has changed after it starts to break down. So if it has a lot of organic matter in it, like peat moss and wood chips and things like that, they will break down pretty quickly and they'll get very, very small and hard to identify separately from each other.
So it gets less fluffy?
Yeah. Go ahead, Tom.
Along similar lines, what about compost? It's like you said, I traveled last summer and I had compost from the whole year before that in one of those big drum composters. We didn't use it last year, but it's still sitting there full. Is that still going to be good for next year?
It should be. So the thing with compost is, let me kind of back up for a minute. You guys all know what soil smells like when it rains, right? You get that really earthy smell. So that earthy smell is actually the bacteria and the fungus in the soil being awake and doing their job. So we want that earthy smell. So your compost should carry that smell. It should be very natural to compost. It shouldn't have any kind of bad odor, but if it's damp, it should have that very earthy smell. So if you were to get it damp, meaning you could squeeze it into a ball and it would sort of stay into a ball in your hand, and it has a nice healthy smell, then it's alive and it's good. It's good to go.
If you have just minor fungal issues on your leaves, can you just cut the leaves off or tear them off and get rid of it?
Yeah, so if we have minor fungal issues just on the foliage, we can, and pruning those leaves off is actually exactly what I would recommend, because you're going to try to get your canopy more open. You want to try to get more airflow through that canopy and reduce the fungal pressure itself. There might come a time where you're like, I got to give up on this. It's completely covered in spores or mycelia, and then you're just going to give up on it, and that's okay. Typically, when we are experiencing a virus or an extreme fungal or bacterial infection, we do not want to add that plant to our compost pile. We might be able to compost the bad things out of it, but it's just likely safer to go ahead and dispose of that. If it's a virus, in fact, we require that we burn that plant material, because viruses can live through extreme temperatures. Yes, Paul?
Do gardeners and farmers actually taste soil, or is that like a Hollywood thing? And if they do actually do it, what are they tasting for?
I think that's more of a Hollywood thing. But,
Okay.
I don't know. Maybe they like how it tastes.
Never seen like a farmer like, it's going to be a good year.
They will smell it, right? Because they'll smell to see if it's alive. Because a healthy soil has that rain smell, and a dead soil either lacks any smell at all or has an off-putting odor.
So a Hollywood scriptwriter saw a farmer smell it and went like, I think you tasted it, and
Yeah,
put it in.
maybe.
Yeah, right. I figured we were getting near the end, and I wanted a fun last one.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy. Oh, do you have another question?
I guess, why should I use, human pieces as compost?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Why should I use human manure as compost?
Human manure?
Yeah.
Human waste?
Yeah.
So human waste can be used as compost. In fact, there's a fertilizer called Milorganite that comes from the city of Milwaukee and is applied to turf grass. In terms of compost, though, I would treat it like chicken waste, and I would compost it for at least 18 months, because the idea is that all the E. coli and salmonella will be combated by the good bacteria. And one thing I had on one of my slides I didn't touch on is anytime a thin-skinned fruit, so we're talking cucumbers, tomatoes, thin skins, right? Anytime they touch the ground, we consider them contaminated. So we wouldn't want to eat that product. I mean, you can at your own risk, still wash it very carefully and very thoroughly, but they can't be sold commercially if they've touched the soil. That's why you see a lot of plastic being used in commercial farming, and it's just a good health standard. So if I were to use human waste, I would really follow that rule carefully. I would not eat anything that came in direct contact with that compost. Chad?
That's the right question to.
With the advent of community farming, we have the urban farm coming here, and having community farms. Is there anything you should be aware of when you're farming around other people's plots of land in that kind of situation?
I think the biggest thing is respect, right? Always respect other people's spaces if you're in a community garden. And chemical usage is a big thing, because drift is real and it's very hard to control that drift in some cases. A couple other things we always want to be careful of in terms of just self-awareness and respect is our pollinators. So always find out if there are any beehives local to your neighborhood, and there's a website that UNL provides called Bee Watch. They really get creative with their names. But Bee Watch registers all the beehives in Nebraska, so you can pull that up and actually see if you have one in your neighborhood that you're not aware of. So yeah, bees and chemical drift are big concerns.
If there's a beehive in your neighborhood, don't put chemicals on your plants. Is that what you're saying?
So there are some chemicals that contain neonicotinoids that you wouldn't want to use at all, and then there are others that you would want to read the label with caution. There's times of year you can apply, times of year you can't, but Bees are a very protected resource right now because they are possibly on the edge of endangerment. Yes.
What if you want something to not like easy to grow? Like what if you have like a thing of strawberries that keeps coming back every year that you want to just
How
stop?
do you get rid of it? You want to kill it?
Yeah.
Okay, so if we want to get rid of a perennial crop that keeps coming back, you chose strawberries, which are easy to get rid of. Horseradish, sunchokes, ginger, those are things that are much more difficult, so let's do the easy one. You could take clear plastic, which actually gets hotter than black plastic, and you could solarize the location, which means you basically put the plastic over it and just let the sun do its magic, and it's going to take you anywhere from 2 weeks to 30 days to kill something that you want to get rid of. If it's a root crop like I described, sunchokes or horseradish, you're going to probably have to bring in the chemical team, and you're going to have to go after it for multiple growing seasons, because every little piece of that root that's left in the soil can generate a whole new plant. So you can't dig it out effectively. You think you did, you didn't. It's going to take both the digging, the chemical, and maybe even the solarization to kill something like that. That's a commitment. If you're going to grow something like that, I recommend doing it in a raised bed where you have control.
How would you get rid of mint if it got away?
How do you get rid of mint? Anything in the mint family. So that's actually most of your herbs. Prayer. And again, sort of the similar processes I'm talking about. So one of the challenges with mint is it roots down at every location where there's a leaf. The technical term for that is a node, but it roots down everywhere there's a leaf. So getting rid of it, again, probably gonna have to use chemicals. Solarization might help. You might wanna go ahead and just kill the turf where it hasn't invaded, if it's in your turf, and then replant your turf later. But yeah, mint is also something I personally would never plant in my own garden. Okay, so I'm gonna, of course, hang out for a few minutes if you have individual questions that you didn't want to ask in front of everybody, but you guys, thank you for being a really great audience tonight and for letting me talk about the things that I love to do every day.
So just real quick, we have our next Hawk Talk in actually 2 weeks, since we did this one a little bit later. On February 8th, same time, same place, Thursday evening, Patty Burris is going to be giving a lecture called A Lost Wetland. It's kind of actually tied in. It's like the literary equivalent of some of the things we talked about today. It's dealing with Willa Cathar's A Lost Lady, if anybody's familiar with that novel. And in that novel, the villain of the story destroys a wetland in order to produce a wheat field simply for profit. And so she's going to be talking about looking at when we destroy some of our natural environments, particularly wetlands. For we all need food, but at the cost, or what is the cost of that? And she'll be looking at it from a literary perspective. So I'm opening it up for everybody to come here on February 8th in a couple weeks. But if we can give Dr. Bush one more round of applause. Thank you so much. And we have plants over here. If you would like to take away a plant and start practicing right away, please do so. And I think there might even be a little more food left over there, particularly the students here. Take free food. Always, if you are a student, always take the free food. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you in a couple weeks.
Great. I even had stuff to take notes on. I've learned. I took notes too. And as you're talking, I have the side of our garden rolling over one side of strawberry. Behind it, I planted a horseradish. And the other side of the garden, I have the mint. And I'm really kind of screwed over who's going to live there next. Nothing that makes something 5% of my house plants have that color.
Do you want me to take your stuff?
Well, I wanted to get these out of the greenhouse. About